If someone tears down your fence in the name of access, what do you owe them? Courtesy, conflict, or the deed to their door? The morning I found the fence down, the sun was already bright enough to make the splinters look like a field of little flags, surrendering in silence. The posts lay like felled soldiers along the survey line, straight as a ruler because truth, when measured, often is. I stood with the rolled deed in my hand, like a map to a country someone insisted did not exist. Property lines are not just paint and pins. They are agreements about who we are when no one is watching. On screen, boundary. She arrived with the breezy certainty of a person who thinks access is a synonym for rights, not a courtesy granted and respected. She said the alley was cramped, the deliveries were blocked, the landscapers needed room, and my fence was in the way of her life. I said the county had marked the pins in fluorescent orange, that the GIS map matched the survey, that the boards were on my side of the truth. On screen, illusion. She smiled the kind of smile that files a claim without paperwork, and told me not to be difficult. Difficult, in these stories, just means unwilling to pretend the line is a suggestion. I asked who took the panels down, and she said, as if commenting on weather, that she had men who could help. Help is an interesting word when it arrives with crowbars. The grass was crushed where boots had stepped, and the screws lay in neat silver constellations that said the decision had been deliberate. I felt anger rise like a sudden storm over a lake, fast and dark, but I also felt the heavy patience that comes from knowing the law speaks slowly. What is offense if not a sentence to land rights to keep its meaning intact? She talked about neighborliness, and I thought about treaties, and how both fail when one side revises the map after signing. On screen, truth. I told her I would rebuild, and she told me I would not, because she needed access, and access was bigger than my preferences. Preferences, she called them, as if boundaries were like music you could change with a new playlist. I walked the length of property with a mason's string and a comb I had to borrow from tomorrow. The string kissed each pin, and each pin echoed a surveyor's oath I'd never heard but trusted anyway. She posted to the neighborhood group before I even reached the far corner, a tidy paragraph casting me as petty and herself as practical. An audience is a kind of accelerant, and digital oxygen makes small fires look like infernos. I took photos, not to win the internet, but to remember that documentation is a form of prayer in disputes like these. Is it petty to want the world to respect a line that costs you savings, weekends, and 1,000 signatures? The contractor who had built the fence answered my text with a time-stamped invoice and a kind of weary empathy that said he had seen this theater before. She stood with her arms folded and her driveway yawning behind her like a mouth demanding more. On screen, escalation. I suggested mediation, and she suggested I grow up, which is to say she suggested surrender with civility. The HOA bylaws fluttered in my browser, like timid birds. Helpful only if you like rules that apologize while speaking. She said the last owner never minded, and that history should be a coupon she could keep using. I said history doesn't transfer when it was an indulgence, not an easement. She laughed and said, "Try me," and the laugh sounded like a hammer tapping a nail to see if the stud is there. The police officer who finally arrived glanced at the pins, glanced at our faces, and advised civil remedies with the neutral tone of someone who rents. Neutrality is another fence, invisible but sturdy, and in that moment I realized I would have to build more than boards. On screen, consequence. I filed the report, scheduled a surveyor, and ordered new posts with the precision of a person who has decided to let time do part of the work. That night, under the lamp at my kitchen table, I read about adverse possession in easements and auctions, words that felt like tools I hadn't learned to use yet. And as the house settled around me and the map of my quiet life redrew itself in the margins, a thought arrived like a blueprint rolled tight and certain. If she wanted access to my line, I might one day find a way to draw a new one around hers. I rebuilt the fence at dawn with the measured calm of a person laying bricks between a wound and the world. By lunch, the panels were down again, stacked neatly like an argument rehearsed, and her landscaper's tire tracks curved across my lawn like signatures on a confession. I learned how quickly patience can feel like complicity when boundaries keep dissolving in daylight. The surveyor arrived with tripods and a voice that treated inches like scripture and maps like gospel. He tapped each pin and pronounced the line as clean as a cut diamond, and I watched certainty pour like light into the gap where doubt had taken a chair. She stood by with a coffee and a smile that performed for the neighborhood feed more than for the truth under our shoes. On screen, narrative. I filed for a temporary injunction and discovered that justice is a queue with 1,000 tragedies ahead of yours. I installed cameras, not to humiliate, but to remember, because memory recorder becomes a witness that does not blink. She sent me messages about community and compassion, while her handyman's pry bar translated them into splintered cedar. On screen, boundary. The HOA president called and suggested that perhaps a gate would be a compromise, but compromise offered at knife point is not a gift. The officer returned, shrugged at the pins, and described the civil courts like a distant shoreline you can see, but cannot swim to today. What is a law if not a promise that time will eventually choose a side? I began collecting paper the way others collect trophies, invoices and affidavits, and certified letters stacking into a fortress with no windows. She collected comments and applause, the soft currency of people who prefer a tidy villain to a complicated page of deeds. On screen, illusion. I read late into the night about easements implied by prior use, about prescriptive rights born from silence, and I realized that refusing to speak is a kind of speech. Silence, I decided, would not be my collaborator. I reported the damage. I tallied the costs. I circled court dates on a calendar that now felt like a chessboard. The small claims hearing arrived and passed like a brief storm, the judge granting a modest sum and a stern reminder that boundaries are to be honored until a court says otherwise. She paid the judgment with a smirk and a promise that access would continue, because her needs were real and mine were rigid. Needs are often what we call our habits when they have learned to argue. I added a lock, she cut it, and each cut felt less like theft and more like a referendum on reality. On screen, consequence. Code enforcement cited her for debris and unpermitted work when a pallet of stones migrated across the line like an invading season. She scoffed at the paper on her door, but paper has a memory that outlives scoffs. I started visiting the county website the way sailors watch skies, scanning the public notices that rise like warning flags before storms. The first time I saw her parcel number on a list, it was a lien for unpaid HOA dues, a small weed sprouting the crack between pride and arithmetic. The second time I saw it, the weed had roots, a tax delinquency notice with dates that sounded like a clock clearing its throat. On screen, leverage. I did not cheer and I did not conspire. I simply read. I asked questions. I learned how auctions work when time has made its final demand. What is revenge if not a story we tell when justice finally favors our patience? I spoke with an attorney who explained redemption periods and bidding rules and how due diligence is just ethics with checklist. I walked the perimeter one more time and felt the absurdity of wooden boards holding back a flood that was now arriving through spreadsheets. She posted a new message about bullies, and I posted nothing, because sometimes the loudest thing you can say is a receipt stamped paid. On screen, law. The auction date appeared on the calendar like an eclipse, inevitable, impersonal, and threw a long, cold shadow over every interaction we had left. And as the days shortened toward that hour, I realized that the story had shifted under our feet from a quarrel about inches to a lesson about choices, and that the line I was about to cross would not be made of wood at all. The auction morning opened like a courthouse hymn, fluorescent lights singing a colorless truth, while footsteps counted down to consequence. I arrived early with a folder of due diligence that felt heavier than wood, pages thick with liens, legal descriptions, redemption periods, and the quiet arithmetic of responsibility. Men with clipboards spoke in abbreviations that make mercy sound optional, and the bulletin board buzzed with parcels whose stories had run out of extensions. On screen, law. I kept hearing my fence creak in my head, the way a memory creaks when it refuses to become just memory, and I wondered whether I had come for justice or proof that the world still honors lines drawn with care. Due diligence had turned me into a surveyor of lives as much as land, and every note I took sketched a map of choices that converged on this cooling room. I traced a chain of title like genealogy, seeing how ownership moves the way riverbeds move, slow, grinding, inevitable, etching patience into the shore. What does it mean to buy a boundary when the currency is not anger but restraint, and the receipt is a deed that says you were willing to let time decide? The clerk read the parcel numbers like coordinates for a spacecraft, sterile and exact. And then she entered, not late so much as carrying the lateness of months. Silence wrapped around her like a coat she couldn't afford to check. She didn't look defiant. She looked tired, which is a kind of apology life never notarizes. And for a second my certainty caught its breath. A man in a suit hovered near her shoulder, whispering terms into a present that had already been pledged to the past. On screen, cost. The crier announced the opening bid with a tone that made money feel like a scalpel. Precise, necessary, unemotional. My hand rose before I had a chance to rehearse a speech about restraint, because sometimes principle speaks with muscle memory. Another bidder jumped in, seasoned by the sport of distressed assets, eyes cool as winter glass, numbers sliding off his tongue like they belonged to him already. The increments moved like chess played by people who never look at the board, and I held my posture the way a fence post holds its plumb line. No sway, no lean, no theater. I thought about 2 inches of cedar and 1,000 pages of law that stand behind it, the absurd way simple things require complex guardians. I thought about the lessons we teach when we are watched and the lessons we teach when we think we are alone, and how both had arrived to sit beside me today. She pressed her lips thin and looked not at me but at the floor, perhaps counting months she had missed or moments she could no longer edit. Was I punishing or protecting, repairing or rerouting? And when doesn't answer earn the right to keep its name? On screen, motive. The number stepped higher, then hesitated, then climbed again like a heart learning a new rhythm, and I met each rise with a nod that felt like signing an oath in slow motion. The room shrank to the auctioneer's cadence in the space between the last bid and the next, that thin breath where futures hang like pendulums. She stepped toward a lectern as if proximity could alter policy. But policy is a river of its own, and today flowed without tributaries. The man in the suit shook his head once, a small denial that carried the weight of rules, and she folded back into her shadow. I saw not a villain in that moment, but a person whose story had been louder than her math, and I told myself that compassion is not the opposite of consequence. Vengeance is sugar, quick and dizzying. Justice is fiber, slow and sustaining, asking for water and time. I set my ceiling and felt its ceiling press back on me, a handshake with my own restraint, a reminder that winning can become losing if you forget why you started. The other bidder stalled, eyes flicking to his notes, and I felt the air change the way air changes right before rain. The hammer hovered, a wooden moon slowing over a tide of breath, and I asked the clerk, quietly, whether post-sale I could record an easement, a cord of mercy braided into the rope of law. The clerk nodded in the neutral language of process, and the nod felt like permission to be more than an algorithm of payback. I placed a final bid with a calm that surprised me, not triumphal, not trembling, just steady as a level's bubble. On screen, truth. The gavel fell, sharp as a snapped twig, and the sound ricocheted through my ribs as if a door had closed and opened at the same time. A hush followed, not reverent, not hostile, just the silence of people recalculating their commutes around a new reality. Paper slid across the counter. Signatures landed like footprints, and the parcel that had trampled my fence became a file folder with my name on it. She met my eyes at last, and in that narrow bridge of recognition, I felt both the sting of what she'd done and the weight of what I had just chosen. Why? Her look asked, the word heavy without breath, and I answered not with a speech but with a simple sentence. Because lines matter, and because mercy needs paperwork if it's going to last. The clerk explained the redemption window in the same tone a doctor explains aftercare. Follow these steps, meet these dates, and a path remains. Outside on the courthouse, steps the sun looked brighter than it had indoors, but I could not feel it fully. The deed warmed my pocket and cooled my pride. What do you do with a victory that tastes like ash if you hold it on your tongue too long? I decided there would be no kicks while she was down, no instant eviction, only terms that honor what the boundary meant without erasing what the human cost had become. On screen, choice. The wind lifted a scrap of public notice across the pavement, like a white flag that didn't know who to surrender to, and I understood that the story had stepped beyond cedar and nails into the difficult geometry of grace. In the end, I had not bought her misfortune. I had purchased a responsibility, and the price printed on the receipt would be the least expensive part of owning it. The week after the auction, the paper cooled into reality, and reality came to the edge of the yard where the old fence line still remembered every argument. I met her there at noon, sun high, shadows honest, the deed in my pocket like a verdict I refuse to read aloud. She looked smaller without an audience, which is to say she looked human, and humanity complicates even the cleanest plans. I told her the redemption clock was running, and the terms were plain, and that I would not use the clock like a cudgel. On screen, boundary. I said I would record an easement across my newly acquired strip that preserved delivery access, clear hours, clear width, clear rules, because access granted is not the same as access grabbed. I said the fence would return straighter and stronger, with a lockable gate whose key I would hand to her when the easement was filed, not as a favor but as a structure we could both lean on. She asked why I would offer a bridge after buying the shore, and I told her, because bridges last longer than victories. On screen, truth. She spoke, finally, of invoices she juggled and a parent she was caring for, and a business that bled through tiny cuts until every bill looked like an enemy. Pain explains but does not entitle, I said, and entitlement explains nothing at all. The words did not feel like triumph. They felt like carpentry, measured, sanded, fit to the grain of the day. I handed her a draft of the easement. Meets and bounds, usage hours, maintenance duties. Mercy translated into lines and signatures. On screen, mercy. She read and cried a little without breaking, and I realized that contrition is quiet because it is work to do. I promised to waive late fees if she entered a payment plan on the taxes within the redemption period, and promised a sale-back option at cost plus costs if she could right the ship in a year. Power that restrains itself becomes stewardship. She nodded like someone who has found the edge of the cliff and the staircase carved into it. We shook hands across the survey pen, a small truce hammered into the soil by two palms that had done enough damage for one season. On screen, repair. I rebuilt the fence with a straightness that felt like prayer, each post in concrete, each board plumb, a clean sentence written where the argument had been. The gate swung true on new hinges, and I slid a key across to her, like a treaty folded into metal. She used it the first week the way one touches a museum piece, careful, unbelieving, then with the ordinary confidence of someone who understands a privilege is safest when it looks like a responsibility. Neighbors slowed their cars and watched without commentary, because resolution does not trend. On screen, illusion. The neighborhood thread lost interest when drama lost oxygen, and I felt oddly grateful to be boring again. I posted one photo anyway, not of her, not of me, just of the gate, captioned, access with consent, and let the algorithm choke on the lack of villain. I registered the easement and the deed on the same day. Book and page numbers like coordinates mapping a boundary that now included a bridge. She sent a text with a receipt for the payment plan and a line that read simply, trying to do it right, and it landed heavier than any apology she could have performed. On screen, consequence. Months thinned the memory of splinters, and grass covered the scars, and I learned that forgiveness is maintenance, not a moment. When the redemption period ended, I kept my promise, offering the buyback on paper, as clean as the one that had once cut, and she accepted with hands that no longer shook. We closed in the same courthouse where the gavel had fallen, this time without spectators, this time with signatures that felt like stitches. I kept a small easement for the fence line, and she kept a small easement for the gate, and the geometry of respect drew itself onto Platt like a quiet victory. On screen, Grace. Standing at the fence that evening, I asked myself what I had actually won, and the answer arrived at a level's bubble-finding center. Not her land, not her defeat, but a boundary that didn't require a war to defend. Isn't that the point of lines? To free us to live, not to recruit us into perpetual patrol. The boards clicked in the breeze like pages turning, and for the first time the story read smooth. No torn corners, no missing paragraphs, only a learned cadence that other hands could follow. If someone tears down your fence in the name of access, build a fence, yes, but build a gate too, and make both strong enough to carry the weight of the truth you agreed to share. Because in the end, ownership is not the prize. Being grounded is, and the only current worth keeping is the one that runs between restraint and responsibility.